We have a couple of questions from the panel, from the virtual audience. The first question is from Professor Schiel, a trained oncologist and past president of COP, the European Society of Pediatric Oncology. But Jill, would it be possible you didn't put your whole question into the chat? Just put it in the chat, and then we can read it and share it with everybody. This would be great as a start off for the discussion, or somewhere within the discussion. That's the first point. The other point I wanted to make, there are many questions also for Joanna Siska, the first presenter that we weren't able to cover it at all. We will ask some of those, and perhaps, for example, Anja Schiel could respond to some of those questions. But in addition, we will also share it with Joanna after the meeting, and we will put those questions and responses on our webpage so that none of your questions is being lost. That's one thing. One question that I wanted to share with you is the one from, here we are. Is there disagreement? And Anja, perhaps this question goes to you. I'm not sure if you can respond to this one, but let's give it a try. Is there a disagreement by a member state on the assessment? Will that be transparent so that the manufacturer is able to prefer for additional discussion at the national level? It is being said all oncology products with a MA submission will have a, that's a new one, sorry. So the question is, if there's a disagreement on the member state, will manufacturers know? Could you respond on this one, Anja?
Yes, so for sure, when it's about joint scientific consultation, that's no problem. In the reports for the joint scientific consultation, there is the report is two parts. One is a consolidated position, which means everything all HTAs participating could agree on. And then there is a second part with national aspects. And in the JSC, it will be very clear what are additional requirements that come from the national perspective of the participants, but also of all the members of the consortium. So in the next 2 years, everybody who's participating has a chance to comment, even if they are not actively involved in a JSC. The JCA is a bit different, but it's not intransparent. Rather, it's the picoscoping that will guide what needs to be in the core report. But it will also be potentially the place where we say not all picos have been included in the core, meaning that there were picos that were submitted maybe by some or only one member state that deviated to such an extent that they couldn't be in the core. That still means that the companies know exactly where the evidence gaps are. But obviously, we are building on the documents that have been developed throughout the joint actions. Part of the development actually includes that we give suggestions to the European Commission in the document where we say, well, okay, we haven't fully adapted yet to the future. There might be some adaptations needed once we really go full-blown into the implementation of the legislation. But it is at all points possible to get the opinion of the individual member states. So all of them have the chance to express that they have maybe a different view, a divergent view. But that's not the same as with the CHMP, where you have a divergent view, you put it on paper, but the decision is still unanimous. This is not how this works. It's not a unanimous decision, it's a consolidated position. That is something different. And there was also this question about the decision in the end. Yes, it is true, all member states have to implement the approval of a drug. No, it is not true. In the end, not every member state has to reimburse a drug just because the JCA said it is acceptable quality. Because that's all it will say. It will not say reimbursement yes, no. It will not state drug A is better than drug B. It will not state these and these methodologies are acceptable for everyone. It will be a very neutral document that reflects what has been done, what has been submitted, and any decision is exclusively at the national level. So the true appraisal happens at the national level, and that can include that every member, every European HTA member has a right to say the report, the JCA didn't fully reflect what I needed. I have to ask for additional analyses. I hope that kind of explains it very clearly.
Okay, thank you very much, Anja. So the next question we have is from the online audience, and this is a question for Solange. And the question is, clinicians appreciate the ESMO methodology to evaluate clinical benefits. Will this be used by the HTA bodies?
Thank you. That's a very, very interesting question. So first of all, we have been working quite a lot since several years with this scale, which is a moving target. What I mean by that is we have created this scale before, for example, the era of immunotherapy. And we had to customize it at the time that the survival description, survivorship has been modified by the emergence of immunotherapy. And now we have to modify it again to be able to acknowledge, for example, single-arm trials, as well as hemato-oncology. So this scale has to evolve with new strategies, new developments, and also new potential toxicities that we cannot expect today. So it's a moving target following the field, the development, the innovation in oncology. That's quite important to say. Why do I tell that? Is I think it's the most usable tool for a regulatory body of any kind to look at a new strategy in the perspective of today, or in the perspective of what is available as a comparator at the moment of the evaluation. So basically the HTA of many countries now in Europe and beyond are using the MCBS to try to prioritize. The spirit of MCBS is not to exclude. If we could have everything which is approved by the regulatory authority and scientifically relevant, we would be very happy. But as countries have to prioritize for sustainability purpose, many HTAs, many countries, probably now between 10 and 30, use already the MCBS just to put in order, prioritize what they want first to be accessible for patients. So that's first thing. And the second thing is, I told before, I was surprised for one of the compounds I was working on to receive a request to know from EMA what will be the MCBS score for this strategy. So I think it's a very robust and reproducible way to evaluate the magnitude of benefits ranked by survival, duration of survival, the duration of progression-free or disease-free survival, as well as quality of life and toxicity. It will be used. To which extent will it be the only parameter? I'm not so sure. Of course, you always have to compare about the existing strategies, but I think it will be one of the parameters used by HTA, and of course, potentially, I hope, by any consortium which will probably work over, before, or in I would say, collaboration with national or regional HTAs. So my advice would be yes, and my guess would be yes, but it might take some time in order to make sure that everybody is able to use it the correct way. And again, the fight is not about excluding patients from any strategy which is evidence-based, but in the world in which we live, we need to prioritize because many countries will never be able to afford all the evidence-based data to be applied to patients.
Thank you. Terrific. So we have now, as I said, Gilles Vassal, Professor Vassal from Paris, who has a question, and he just asked, is he allowed to speak? We will try to unmute you, but let's check whether we are able to do this one. Give us 1 second. Where is he?
He disappeared.
He disappeared. As
There he is.
Yeah, here he is.
Talking permitted.
Yeah, talking permitted. So now, Jill, is it possible for you to speak?
Hello everyone, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share with you some thoughts I really appreciate, and especially when it was really not planned for any participant from the audience. The thing I wanted to share with you is the following. I am Gilles Vassal, a pediatric oncologist from Gustave Roussy, and I am leading the oncopolicy program in Salute Europe and chairing the Accelerate multi-stakeholder international platform. What I wanted to share with you is that in pediatric oncology, we do have now a few new anti-cancer medicines which have been recently approved for the treatment of childhood cancer and leukemias, and more in the future. And clearly they are expensive. And we really want to work with everyone to assure that access to these innovations is equal across Europe for all patients. And clearly to this extent, we recently published a paper on the market access and patient access of 3 recently approved medicines in 9 jurisdictions. And we showed that across this HTA bodies evaluation, there are differences, major differences in terms of timing for delivering the evaluation, but also in terms of data requested, additional data, and in terms of decision. And based on that, we had earlier this year an initiative through Accelerate with representatives from EMA, from UNETA 21, from industry, from advocates, and from academia to discuss together what could be done to improve the evaluation, to improve the access to those medicines now and in the future. And just to be brief, one of the 6 recommendations is very specific to pediatric. As you know, in pediatric oncology, there is a pediatric regulation where any development of a drug in children, pediatric development, should be approved by EMA through a pediatric investigation plan. And the proposal is that this development, this agreement on the PIP, the name of this such development, should really be done through an early dialogue with EMA and HTA bodies, with the help of advocates and academia, to assure that what will be generating during the development plan will also generate the data needed for HTA body evaluation. Because as you know, we have a rare disease. The randomized clinical trial against placebo double-blind is not something we can often do, very rarely. And often we have single-arm trial, and the need for generating external controls is something very important. And if there is an early decision of what would be needed in parallel to the clinical trial, that would improve at the time the drug is ready for filing, because the drug would be really effective in children, effective and safe, then the data will be also available for HTA body. So sorry for being long, I just wanted to share with you with the key message. The pediatric oncology community and parents community working together are very keen to contribute over the next 3 years and beyond to the implementation holder initiative, one of the important part of this. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share this with you.
Thanks very much, Professor Vassal. Now, I have a question perhaps to Michael Ermisch. Regarding, let's say, you shared some view on, let's say, the national implementation of the European legislation. So this considerably differs if you are from, let's say, a big country, France, Germany, versus, let's say, small countries, versus Eastern Europe, versus, let's say, established Western Europe markets. What is your view on, let's say, national adaptation in the eyes of a very heterogeneous European national situation? How to tackle this issue?
Well, I mean, that's one of the core questions we're tackling right now. I mean, UNETA 21 just published their view on how the PICO schema is to be, how the scoping process and the PICO is to be designed. And there is an interesting and really important thought in that. I mean, we can all agree on that the PICO scheme is the one we do the HTA on, where we look upon. And the important question for us is the population often is given, in most countries is given by the drug, because it's the authorization. The authorized population is mostly the relevant population. There might be countries who choose at this point. Germany does not. So for us, important is the whole population. The intervention is also clear. That's the drug we're assessing. And then it's the comparator. And of course, I already said that you want to know, is it better than what you're currently using, and how much is it better? And so we do have to look upon what is used in every country as the current standard of care. And as long as countries differ a lot in availability, this will differ. And of course, this is a problem because it makes up a whole list of PICOs that need to be dealt in parallel. And this cannot be mended by then saying, well, we have to overgo what you need to take what Germany needs. This cannot be the answer, because every health system wants to know, is the new drug better and how much better than what we have currently now? Maybe we will go over bridges and do some indirect comparisons of that. That's methodological question and challenges, but we cannot say any country needs to, well, simply adapt to what other countries need. So this is the core problem. There are different comparators, and we will see how different they really are. And with the merging of the PICO schemes that is foreseen, it might come that from 27 countries, there are in the end 3 or 4. This will even be better for companies than dealing with 27 different countries and giving them 27 different dossiers. But it's not what is dreamt of, one dossier, one comparator for whole Europe. But that's an economical question. How does Europe come to completely equal standards in healthcare? And as long as this is not achieved, well, HTA is about comparing two standards of care. And we cannot do anything about that.
Yeah, I think, but you describe, I think, the actual challenge. We may lead to this may lead to a situation, if it's just empirically derived PICOs, it leads to a situation which is unworkable, not for the evaluators, the assessors, nor the companies. In the limited time that's out there for this EU assessment. And then the question is, and we heard Anja earlier, she says there is something that makes something not being part of the core PICO and saying, like in the regulation, it's explicitly foreseen, this is so specific, it's so rare that this comparator is of clinical relevance in your country, that you may have to do this on your own. The provision is in the regulation exactly there. That countries can do extras if something is not part of the core. And Anja's point, I think, went a bit in this direction, that there may be a core and something that's, probably not part of this core that can realistically be assessed in the time that's out there. I don't know if Anja, you made this point earlier. I don't know if she's still there.
Yeah, I'm still here. The thing is that we have also realized the challenges of the timelines. And we have also realized the challenges with the PICO approach, because I think that, again, not everybody is having the same basic concept of the PICO. So for us, we are very realistic. We look at the evidence presented, and then we decide whether it actually addresses a relevant PICO. The UNETA way is, you are told there is a drug going to come in that indication, potentially within this evidence. What is your PICO of interest? It's the reverse. And this is not, how we pragmatic people tend to do it. Others want to define this PICO beforehand. And I can understand that this is very user-friendly for the industry, because if you have like 3 PICOs, then you know which indirect comparisons you need to provide in your submission. But we also saw the timelines, and I also fully agree the PICO comes too late. The PICO should be before the submission that is in parallel to day 0 to the CHMP procedure, because then there would be enough time to actually provide this. And I don't know if it's possible for the industry to come up with, all indirect comparisons that might be relevant, find the data, and then do, in addition, network meta-analysis, and all this in these, 40, 50 days they get. That maybe the timings and the timelines are not yet optimized, I would say. So maybe there is room for improvement to provide more time for the relevant work. But in the end, all I can say is, come for joint scientific consultations. You will be told then what is the expectation, and it's you who decides how much time you have between a scientific consultation and the actual action that happens at the CHMP and the UNETA at that time point. And then you can come prepared. And if you come prepared, then, providing these indirect comparisons might not be so difficult. But if you come unprepared and you are confronted then with 5 PICOs, I can understand that seems like a very high hurdle and a challenge that might not be feasible to be achieved by the industries in the given time. Nor would it be possible for us as the assessors to actually provide a good assessment in the short timelines. So yes, there is still work to be done, and there is still time to rectify these kind of mistakes that might be in the system.
Thank you. We have one question within the panel here. It's Natalia and then Oriol. First, Natalia.
Thank you very much. I would like to make a follow-up question on your comment, Anja, and touch upon the question of the early scientific consultation, because I believe this is a really critical point. It was named also by the patient representatives as well as you, Michael. I think there is a clear understanding on the importance of this scientific consultation, but on the other hand, there is a gap between this importance and what is in capacity currently named in the regulation. So it seems that probably not all the drugs will have this consultation. And the question is how we can make sure within this short period of time, 2.5 years, until the first implementation, that each drug, which means this consultation, will be assessed, will be consulted, so how to close this gap. I don't know who can answer this question, but maybe to brainstorm together, because it seems there is a gap currently.
Michael, yeah.
Maybe I can try a bit. I mean, this discussion has been open in Germany too, whether these, I think 150 are envisaged in the beginning as joint scientific consultation. This is, of course, much less than we're currently doing in Germany over the Joint Federal Committee. But being part of this process, I must also say that not all of those scientific consultations are really worth being consulted. There are a lot of questions which companies could answer for themselves if they watch the system and what is asked from them. So it's a lot of texts that are readily prepared and that are just compiled. And more than once or twice a year, this is fully sufficient to answer all of the questions. So, of course, constrained resources are a problem. It will be seen whether this is enough or whether it's not enough. But maybe it also brings a bit more wisdom to the companies and looking at guidances, looking at what has been said earlier. And if you orient your development plan on what has been said already, maybe you don't really need to ask. And sometimes I must admit, I have the feeling that asking at least the Federal Joint Committee is not for the people who go there in the end and are talking to the Federal Joint Committee people. They already know the answers. They just need them written down to present them internally and tell their superiors, well, they're really saying that. It's not just me, it's them. Maybe this learning curve is not steep enough currently.
Oriol?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for all your comments. I think it's been tremendously insightful. Luckily, in the last couple of comments, we've seen or we've heard about early advice, early consultation, which I think is critical. But I have not heard two things. One is how binding that early advice could be, and whether the HTA or this scoping process should be before the EMA process, which could be one thing. So the timing of this HTA process. And the second thing, which is maybe what is worrying me a bit more, is no one has talked about the assessment of the need. How that is going to be incorporated into the process. So do we need 10 more immuno-oncology drugs, or do we need to invest in other things?
Within the panel?
I would just maybe answer the need, but not the regulatory question, but the need. I agree, it's a very, very important comment. because whatever scale you use, and now you have seen probably that FDA is facing this kind of scenario of having encore drugs coming with the same price, right? With absolutely no change in how expensive are these compounds. It's just about having new compounds with the same indication, same benefit, or same efficacy. So there's something missing in all our models, is to define the need and to avoid the reproduction, the mimicking of the same result by different pharma companies, because first of all, it costs a lot to the society, it costs a lot to the regulatory authorities, and it's absolutely useless. We are playing marketing issues. So I would not have any answer to that. But about the need, I think at some point, in terms of HTA, probably more than EMA, because EMA is looking first at the science, so the level of evidence, the degree of recommendation, something which are measurable and reproducible. But at the level of the coordination of HTA, there must be, and maybe there will be, some criteria just to try to define novelty, to define how innovative, how paradigm changing can be something. Because it should be something that is evaluated but is out of the rank today of what we use as scales, including the MCBS. So that's a very good question, and I think we should think about measuring novelty.
I think measuring novelty, it may be an interesting element for an assessment later on. But the question is, if at an early stage of development, this is not engineering, so we don't engineer drugs. There's a lot of things that happen during development that ultimately deliver a certain efficacy, a certain outcome, that we don't engineer upfront or know upfront. And I think this is something that we should consider when we discuss such topics. During the past 10 years, I went through many such discussions where health economists wanted to kill drugs. So the idea to offer, I kill this early. This was podium discussion. That's how to find ways to kill this early based on a cost effectiveness threshold that, for example, NICE would use. And I think there is an idea that a company should know that there may be limited space for this. And I think there should be an idea of how payers react to this. The idea to have very definitive answers at this early stage is, in Germany, we would say it's an Anmaßung von Wissen. That's just not out there. It's too bold of an idea of what can be delivered.
I think
I would agree. So I would agree. I think there are these FDA discussions. There are clinical constraints, clinical trial constraints. There are certain clinical constraints which I think we need to reflect. And I think the FDA, for example, or a regulatory agency has to reflect. Also, clinicians have to reflect. But I would not say that's a payer early kill question.
Anja?
Yeah, so to the last one, I mean, we have a rather straightforward way of stopping stuff we don't need. We get an order from the health department to the HTA assessment agency that says we want you to assess this and this drug. And that also means they look at proposals and then they say, this is not a drug we need, and then we don't want you to assess it. It's that simple. So the sooner and the more often a drug is not even ordered to be assessed, the clearer it becomes to the industry, I guess, that this was a product they developed, and I'm painfully aware that this is at the very last moment they realize they spent all this money and they're not going to get anything back for it.
In Norway.
So it's a waste of money. I would prefer if we had all these discussions a lot earlier. But the other point that was asked is about the capacity and the legal binding aspect. So the capacity, that is something you can build up. We do between 70 to 90 standard scientific advices per month at EMA. That's an awful lot. But it's also done because it has a slightly different format. So the majority is written responses, no discussion meetings, no 4-hour meeting within the scientific advice week, because then we wouldn't be managing these many scientific advices. And I totally agree with Michael. Lots of them are just the usual, I have to show my management that this and this and this is the opinion that we already know, but now it's confirmed because it's black and white on paper. You can cut down on those. But neither is a scientific advice legally binding, nor do I think should HTA advice be legally binding, because it's clearly stated that this is given advice, scientific advice, and also HTA is mainly scientific advice at that moment, based on the current standings of the science. And if you come and you bring me your study data 3 years later, then the unfortunate comparator issue will come up again. 3 years ago, I knew exactly what my comparator would have been. 3 years later, the landscape might have changed. And then my opinion must change as an HTA. And the same is this PICO problem. So I think Ansgar already mentioned it. If you have to make a hypothetical PICO based on a hypothetical indication that is requested by the company, and you don't know what the final indication is going to be that the CHMP is granting, then you might spend a lot of time on nothing, because if the indication wording is very different, or even slightly different, that can have a huge impact on the PICOs that are relevant. And then, you know, we might have come with 3 PICOs, and then once the final indication wording is there, we realize we should have picked 3 others, and 2 till in addition, because then suddenly everything changes. Then suddenly, if it's a restricted population, there are different comparators to consider, and we cannot be so wide in our acceptance of potential comparators. And we can also only talk about potential comparators as long as we don't know the exact indication wording. So that there is a problem there in when to do the HTA and what is realistic between, you know, the wishful thinking in the PICO and, as I say, how we do it, the realistic assessment. Is this evidence package actually answering a question that is relevant to my decision making in my healthcare system? There's 2 different aspects of the PICO, and we cannot get them done at the same time properly. And I think that is something that everybody's realizing, that this is very, very difficult, and it can in the end lead to not achieving what we really wanted.
Okay. Thank you, Anja. Before we move to the next audience question, there's a couple of comments come in on the chat, which I'm going to read out. So Gilles Vassal says, measuring novelty and evaluating unmet medical needs. Unmet medical needs is proposed to be a major driver of the revised paediatric and orphan regulations. And we also have a comment from Wolfgang Reiner saying there is also value in competition of drugs in the same disease area with comparable effectiveness. Otherwise, we continue to have just one option in the market.
Terrific.
Yeah.
So before coming to the questions in the audience, I want to play a question to Antonella. I think patient involvement, I think we would all agree, is key to the whole thing. In the end, it's about patient value to patients. Now, patient involvement is also always structurally a challenge, because real patients with pancreatic cancer, for example, they have hardly time, and so they have other problems than the EU HTA regulation. So what is the best way to get the strongest patient voice into those discussions, and how to best orchestrate this one? So what is your idea or vision on this one, perhaps?
Yeah, well, it's what I'm doing, for instance. I'm not a cancer patient myself, but I am a cancer patient advocate. So I've developed this expertise, and I'm sensitized specifically towards cancer patients. So this is one thing, but also like for cancer patient advocates, it is important, what I mentioned in my presentation, to be empowered, and we can be empowered through knowledge. And the knowledge doesn't develop on its own, so we need to develop training, skills, educational programs. So this is something that it's the responsibility of cancer patient associations to do that. But of course, it is also something that we need to do in partnership with other stakeholders who already have the knowledge. And what I also believe is that, we are talking about the involvement of patients. It is important, but I've heard very little about the involvement of patients by the European Commission and by UNETA. So I think that, there is some trust that needs to be developed there. And we're here for that too.
Thank you. Richard, do you want to comment?
Yeah, well, I certainly would chime with that, and I think patient involvement for organisations. I think I mentioned the EMA, and when I spoke of it, I think they've seen how valuable they can be in helping their thinking. We, as an organisation, have found our patient advisory committee incredibly insightful at key points, and we have them patients on our board now and in all of our projects because it's just that fresh insight. And there's many different types of ways in which patients can be involved. It can be through representatives from the patient organisations. It can be patients themselves. We now have expert patients. So that I think UPATE was mentioned earlier today. So there's just a great variety of ways in which patient involvement can be brought in, and all of those things should be explored. And I think if the new structures get it in early, I'm sure it will grow by itself, and the value will increase.
So I think the next question was Monter in the panel here.
My perception is that if you look at Europe from a macro perspective, HTA divergence is not the most important issue, but rather divergence in access to patient. And EMA aim to resolve the access to patient, but harmonize the marketing authorization only. I'm wondering whether HTA harmonization is going to harmonize only the value perception or assessment, or if it will harmonize the access. I believe no, because the reason for differential access is the difference in affordability, the difference in GDP. So the real question would then be, should we discuss directly differential pricing, or should we discuss European procurement for drugs? I'm afraid the HTA will be just an extra layer that will be harmonized with no impact on patient equitable access across Europe. That's a question for the panelists.
Solange Peters, I would agree with you. I think differential pricing is probably the most flexible and sustainable way to move. It's a very complex model to build. It's not only about GDP, it's about, in general, how the health system is built in terms of encompassing various populations in the country, and how the insurance can also participate in a unique, equitable coverage of patients' needs. But we are working on that. We almost are going to publish a model for this differential pricing, which is probably 5 to 10 years of work with the London School of Economics to try to understand how to build it. But to me, it's the only way at some point to go beyond the general EMA HTA analysis, which is transversal, but to create, the vertical dimension of every country or even every patient group. So I think we really need to move into that and applying models, maybe testing models, simulating models, but I think that's the only way to move, unfortunately, and it's going to add some complexity to everything which has been discussed today.
I think you don't need complex model. It worked pretty well for vaccine by tier pricing, and it has shown to be very effective. So we work on it already more than 10 years ago, but at that time it was not the perspective of the European Commission. But it's not that complex to implement. I understand from an academic perspective, if you want to understand all the drivers of how much a country is ready to invest, it's very complex. But if you want, from a pragmatic perspective, enhance access in countries with different healthcare system, affordability, culture, etc., it is not that complex.
Without going into detail, I think I should certainly say FBI has also released a paper, a discussion paper, which of course also highlights the challenges of such an approach. But clearly there is something, and you said this on the slide, there is something that has to do with the GDP when you see this weight indicator. There's also Norway. Norway is not on the far left, it's Germany that's on the far left. So it's not only the GDP. There's other preferences that play a role, and Norway is quite in the center of such a slide. But GDP plays a massive role, and I think it's a discussion not maybe for here, but there's activity around this discussion, which I think is good.
And maybe just to take that up, I also don't think that HTA will solve this problem, but I mean, with the EMA approval, we have the answer to the question whether the drug does more good than harm. And with the HTA, we will have the answer how it compares to what is already available. And if this HTA is done sufficiently fine, then this answer will be, you can test it, you can rely on this answer. And if you have a reliable answer, how it compares to what you generally use, it's then on a country level easier to decide how much you're willing to pay for it and if you're willing to reimburse it, if you have this possibility of saying no. But that's, I mean, so it's one step into this direction, but surely not the last one.
I would like to ask Solange Peters an additional part of this question back, because I appreciated very much your vision of, let's say, European guidelines, living guidelines, and so on. But we had a look a while ago into the key German national S3 guidelines and how long it takes a new drug to occur on the guideline, the timeline between. And it was a little more than 2 years. So different by drug and so on and so on. But if there is no simultaneous availability of those clinical value judgments, then they will not be heard in the HTA process, because HTA occurs at time of EMA approval or a little later. That's the one thing. And the other thing I wanted to ask, how are you going to deal within your guidelines with the plethora of national guidelines that are often not in the same line, that have different national recommendations and so on? That's a big area of work from my point of view for a European scientific organization.
Thanks a lot. So the guidelines is probably also the flagship of ESMO, because the ESMO guidelines are now the most cited because of our presence in Europe and in Asia. It's interesting because, of course, the US has this NCCN guideline, which is another way to present data, which is really based on the criteria of reimbursement by insurances in US, and it plays a role for reimbursement, by the way. But in Europe and in Asia, we have the ESMO guidelines. So the methodology is quite easy. The timing is an issue, I agree. So what we do, we have a huge office, right? And they screen and they survey all the FDA and EMA new registrations, new drugs coming, right? As soon as we have one, we immediately give an MCBS score. So the first thing we do is to potentially for HTA or potentially for any regulatory body or any decision-making process, the MCBS score is usually following an EMA or an FDA approval. And remember, FDA comes very often first. In the week or the 2 weeks later, you have an MCBS score. At the time being, I agree with you. The ESMO guidelines were taking 6 months, 1 year or 2 years to take this drug and its MCBS score into the text, right, and the algorithm. With the living guidelines, the ISD is at least 2 to 4 times per year. Adapt the guidelines as soon as you have a new MCBS score. Then you need to add the drug in the algorithm. It will be less wordy, but more schematic, right? It has to be hosted and acknowledged in the guidelines. So by doing that, I think at least in real time, or at least real time, almost real time, the guidelines should be adopted. It means that we need to have a very active group of people to review. Because the second question you have is the rigor. So what we do to accommodate the national differences is to have in our guidelines a representation, at least not of every country, but region of Europe, and the key opinion leader in the branch. So the decision is made democratically and unanimously among these people, meaning that when we will implement changes, we will need also this unanimous vote. So it means that everything we do, right, will be in real time and will be endorsed by the regional disparities in terms of standards of care. But just to discuss that, when you have an MCBS, a level of evidence and a degree of recommendation from a group of experts, I don't think so much that disparities in opinion should count at that point. I think we are in an evidence-based environment with the magnitude of benefit of everything we do. From that time on, I think it's pretty easy to write guidelines which should be understandable by all. But the dynamic process is really a challenge. And I can tell you we have dozens and dozens of people working on that continuously. It's really a challenge.
Brilliant. Thank you, Solange. Can I ask, Peter, do you still have a question?
Well, I still have. I'm not sure if I'm audible. Yeah, I wanted to pick up on the point that Jörg earlier made to Antonella on the involvement of the patient. I think what is interesting is that Solange, Solange said, sorry about the names, that Solange said something about the MCBS and the role of the adverse events in that. And while I know that obviously for HTAs you're much more into also the quality of life impact, and I was wondering how much does that play a role? And then as going to the patient, how can you build that into this decision making? Or is this going to even make these disparities longer? Because I was earlier this week at the patient preference group or conference where they talked about patient preferences and how that should be taken into account when we make our benefit risk assessment as regulators. So I was wondering how much could that play a role in HTA to get that patient voice better integrated in your decision making? But maybe it only complicates matters.
I can only tell you how we did accommodate quality of life, so patient-related outcomes in the MCBS. Remember, think about metastatic patients, probably the most relevant to speak about quality of life of a long-lasting treatment. What we do, remember, it's 1 to 5. So the quality of life can impact in terms of if the quality of life assessment is showing an improvement, you will gain 1 point, which is substantial in a scale from 1 to 5. The other way around, if you have a relevant toxicity of high grade 3 and more, you might lose 1 point. So it's quite relevant. It corresponds to 15% survival, right, at 2 years. So it's really something that has to really be measured as one of the parameters to be taken into account. The difficulty is a lack of systematic assessment of quality of life. And the second difficulty is usually the big journals don't want quality of life to be published in the primary manuscript. So again, for my staff, they have to survey the data because the quality of life usually comes 6 months, a year, or 18 months after the primary results. So the problem is that we underestimate the role of quality of life and patient-related outcomes in the whole magnitude or in the whole of the perspective of what we do. So we need to advocate for that because we can't wait 18 months to know if the patient was feeling well with the treatment.
Anja?
Yeah, I want to make one small critical remark to the MCBS because it does include costs. I work for an HTA. I know for sure that the one thing I don't know is what anybody pays in reality for a drug. The price is the one thing that is the dark horse and you don't know it. So if you talk about costs, are you talking about the costs that are connected to giving the drug, or are you talking about the costs of the drug? Because if you're talking about the costs of the drug, you are probably using some numbers that are completely unrealistic.
There's absolutely no cost and pricing in the MCBS. MCBS is really about the hazard ratio for survival and PFS and the absolute benefit, as well as the long-term benefit of strategies, the toxicity, and the quality of life. There's absolutely no cost. And again, it was really built not to exclude countries to take new opportunities into account, but really to help them prioritize. So the cost is not there. I was speaking about the cost in terms of symptoms and toxicity management of symptoms and side effects.
And one comment coming back to the joint procurement and the learnings from the COVID. Yes, if you have joint procurement, then Europe is buying something. And if Europe is buying something, then it's up to Europe to decide who gets what, how much, and for what price. And then I see no problem in that. And I would expect that then also at the European level, someone should hopefully have made this cost effectiveness assessment, which we can hope for, or maybe it was done. I don't know how that worked for joint procurement. But one thing that I definitely have learned is you can't make anybody sell you something if they don't want to. And that is our biggest problem. Access to drugs for patients in Europe is unfortunately largely dependent on whether companies find a market interesting or not. And it really is the only solution you can find for that is you only give approval if you promise to sell it to everyone. That is the way to go. Not telling the HTAs that they have to somehow make it, pay even more if you're a rich country or not, because that's not going to change that some markets are completely unattractive. So if people want to have a different system, if they want a European HTA, then you have to be Europe and not 27 member states. That's the only way forward. That's the puzzle I was talking about. If we agree that at the end there is a puzzle that includes the end of national decision-making and the end of national HTA and the end of anything else, then a joint procurement, joint financing, and then we deal internally with those that have less money and those that can pay more for the drugs, then that is a nice puzzle to work on. But that's, for me, a very, very far away optimal future that I just don't see happening. And that's why the puzzle looks so fragmented at the moment. We are picking at pieces. We're not looking at the big picture. Nobody wants to, speak it out loud what the elephant in the room is. You can control prices if countries compete with each other, because that's what's happening. We are competing with each other. The industry is competing with each other. In such a system, economic rules are simply applying, and then you have to live with facts like, if you're not an attractive market, you're not going to get a drug. It's that simple. And that's fair enough because these are companies, and companies live in the other half of the economic world. They have to make money, and that's their right. And they can decide for whom to go when they want to sell or not. So if you want to change, all the problems we're having, you have to change the route. And we're never addressing the root. We're only addressing, the higher up, easy to reach branches with the low hanging fruit.
This is a very simplistic view of the world. I think, as you rightly say, I think this is a vision that's not close to any real scenario in the near term. But I really think we can do better in terms of providing access earlier. And as you say, I don't think that countries compete here. I think there's an interest of companies to sell their products. I think that's true. And selling their products is the complement to providing access. Without this, there's no return. I think that the model that you have is very, very simplistic. And there's a second best. I think we live in a second best scenario. And in this second best scenario, also we as industry believe we can do better. And this doing better, yes, it includes also EU HTA, but there's other elements that we have to resolve. And when we talk about Europe, we come quickly to this point of economic diversity or divergence in economic abilities. These we have to address. Yes, Europe is not willing to be solidaric and to say we have a European fund and we do all healthcare together. There's no commitment for this. And still we can do better. And still there's opportunity to work better together with companies. There was the pediatric oncology project in Paris, France. It was a European project, as far as I understood. We need more of these projects that look into very concrete situations. What are the issues and what can we do? We can do better even in this second best world that we live. We don't have to go back into a planned economy. It's no need to. We can do better than we do today, but it needs to, or even more, to be part of this.
It's probably also the reason why it took such a long time, 3 joint actions, which is very uncommon in the European Union, and now this, let's say, tender agreement. It shows how difficult this situation is to tackle appropriately. But I think that's the task ahead, and our task is to support making it a success in the end. But before closing, I think some of the ramifications of Peter's questions on, let's say, patient involvement, timing of patient involvement. Our recruiter is here from IQWiC. IQWiC is often involving patient, but it's not 10s or 20s. It's one patient that they are approaching. So it is a challenge how to get patients timely involved. I don't know if you, and patients to some extent should have also the last word here.
Well, I want to comment on what Peter said about including the quality of considering quality of life, considering real world data and all that. It's fundamental. Now we are, I believe, at a stage where we cannot go back. So we must keep into consideration the patient voice. It must be heard. It's not something. It's not something that it is just technical. So it implies a change of culture. And if it took 10 years to EMA to get to a decent point, it took 3 joint action for UNETA, it may take many more years, despite the evidence that involving patients is beneficial to the system. I mean, there has been this PREFER project, the IMI PREFER project, showing that clearly that there is benefit in involving patients into a preference study, but then only few patients were involved in the entire process of that project. So patients they needed to be involved, but also they needed to grow in the system. We need to find ways together to allow patients to grow in the system and to make them in the system efficient and effective. Of course, we do not want to slow down the system. I mean, we want to accelerate the system. And so we need together to find ways to reach that level. And it won't be done tomorrow. It takes time.
Richard, do you have any comment on this one?
Yeah, well, I think today we've obviously highlighted some of the problems that we can clearly see with the HTA regulation that we can envisage in the future. I think problems are solved together, though, and as these structures are set up to implement the regulation, there is this real risk that we see a sort of reversion to some old ways of working, where you have member state committees that become closed shops, that become places that are hard to penetrate or find out hard decisions are being made. But if we can have a more open form of decision making, more open forms of dialogue, I think some of these problems can be overcome together, be it resistance at national level or other obstacles that may occur. So that kind of culture, getting it right from the start, is going to be critical.
Thank you very much. I think in terms of timing and everything, we are at the end of this first day of our convention. Thanks to all presenters, thanks to all panelists, thanks to the technical supporters, thanks to the audience, to the virtual audience, everybody. The web stream of the event will be published on our website. Also, we will aim for addressing the remaining questions on our website and go back to Joanna and cover this one. The abstracts of the Impulse presentation, each presenter had a short abstract, will also be published on our website. The manuscripts of the results of our survey that we have done prior to this one is currently close to acceptance. I think we may make this point. And the whole recording of this session will also be available on the web stream. Now, to everybody also on the virtual participants, the EAA is aimed to become a continuous event biannual convention, with the next one coming up in October 28, 29 in Brussels at Fleric Business School and virtual, so that you are already aware of this date. And with this one, I hand over to Elaine for the last comments.
Yes, thank you very much again also from my side for your attendance, for being so active, for asking questions, for having comments. And of course, we would very much appreciate your feedback on today's session so that we can improve for Brussels for next time. So please use the feedback form that we have here on the QR code. We will also send around an email later on if you can't catch this QR code now on the screen. But yeah, we would really appreciate if you would fill out the questions. Thank you very much.